Who are the greatest players of all time for all 32 NFL teams? What's going on, football fans? It's Mitch back here with another NFL video. This time, a historic NFL video. The 5 greatest players for all 32 NFL franchises. That's right, my picks for the 5 best players on your favorite team, in your favorite team's history of their franchise. How iconic was that player? What were their stats like? How many rings did they have? Did they make the Hall of Fame? All-decade teams, all-pros, Pro Bowls, all that included in my selections for these lists. I took a lot of time. I gathered a lot of information and stats. And now I'm here to provide the 5 greatest players of all time for every NFL team. Plus, one honorable mention for all 32 NFL franchises. If that sounds good, Gronk, spike the like button. The more likes we get, it's more likely that I'm doing more of these videos. So keep that in mind. Subscribe to the channel for more NFL content, ranking everything just like this, and get in the comments and let me know if you agree with my lists for all 32 teams, especially your favorite team. I want to hear from the fans. What do you think of my top 5 plus one honorable mention for your favorite team, the greatest players of all time for your favorite team? Let's go, man. Let's rock. Of course, in alphabetical order, beginning with the Arizona Cardinals. The greatest player, in my opinion, in Arizona Cardinals history is wide receiver Larry Fitzgerald. I grew up watching Larry Fitzgerald. And the one thing that stands out to me with Larry Fitzgerald is the 2008 playoffs. I still remember where I was in the moment that he caught that slant for a long touchdown against the Pittsburgh Steelers in that Super Bowl, man. In that playoff run, he was simply unstoppable. It was the peak of his play, his peak of his powers. 546 yards, 7 touchdowns in 4 games in the 2008 playoffs. He led the NFL in receptions and touchdowns twice throughout his career. But the one player I think of with the Cardinals is absolutely Larry Fitzgerald. Just a class act. Always on the football field, always producing, perimeter receiver, slot receiver, Hall of Famer, Larry Fitzgerald. Number 2, for the young guys out there, might not know who Larry Wilson is, but Larry Wilson, a safety with 5 straight first-team All-Pro nods. Second in MVP votes in 1966, with 10 interceptions on that season, leading the league. Larry Wilson, an absolute ball hawk for the Cardinals. Patrick Peterson is my number 3, which a little bit surprising because I never really thought of Patrick Peterson as one of these iconic Cardinals. But when you really look at the body of work of what he has amassed throughout his career, 3-time first-team All-Pro. In 2012, he wasn't even an All-Pro player, and that might have been his best season of his career with 7 picks and 5 fumble recoveries. That's 12 turnovers. And as a rookie, the one thing that stands out, he was an electric punt returner. He had 4 punt return touchdowns in that season as a rookie. Patrick Peterson, lockdown man corner in his peak, could also return punts and was a heck of a playmaker. He's one of those guys that if he would have played for a bigger franchise, he's probably more well-regarded, but Peterson was a great player in this era. Aeneas Williams is next up, another cornerback on the list and another secondary member here. 2-time All-Pro for the Cardinals. He also played for the Rams and was an All-Pro there. 9 interceptions, 6 interceptions, 6 interceptions, and 6 interceptions 4 seasons in a row for the Arizona Cardinals. That is really hard to do. 9, 6, 6, 6 picks in a row for Williams, and he was also a pretty heavy hitter. He was one of the best corners of the 90s. At number 5, I think of him as an announcer. Dan Deerdorf, great right tackle in his day. 76, 77, 78, referring to 1976, 1977, 1978, first team All-Pro member. 3 more second team All-Pros and second team All-70s member, where there were a lot of good offensive linemen. He was also extremely versatile in his day and could play a lot of different positions. Very underrated all-time offensive lineman and a really good, fun announcer that I remember growing up with the CBS broadcast, especially for Patriots games. At number 6, Roger Worley. 7-time Pro Bowler, 3-time first-team All-Pro, another secondary member, another safety. It's in the lineage of the Cardinals. Another one that's not even here is Budda Baker, who is still playing for the Cardinals, but 7-time Pro Bowler, 3-time first-team All-Pro, 3rd most interceptions in Arizona history. He is my honorable mention. That is the Cardinals, guys. Cardinals fans, let me know what you think about that one. Next up, we've got the Atlanta Falcons. And my first choice, or my number 1 player, might be slightly surprising because it's Julio Jones, right? And a lot of people will see on the list Deion Sanders and be like, Mitch, why is Deion Sanders not first? Well, you have to kind of understand that Deion Sanders only played 5 seasons with the Atlanta Falcons. So that's also taken into account on these lists, is how long these players actually played. A lot of historic players did not only play for one team, believe it or not. So it is difficult to actually have that lineage with one team. But Julio mostly had all his iconic years with the Atlanta Falcons, 2 first-team All-Pros, a 3-time yards per game leader throughout his career. Julio was one of the most physically gifted receivers and football players you will ever watch. From day one, it was evident he was big, strong, faster than anybody out there, and had incredible mitts. I mean, this guy could catch the football. And then you watch the way he would run routes as a big human that could run routes as a much smaller human would type of run, right? Like those type of routes where he's changing direction. Unbelievable player. Unbelievable athlete. Julio, to me, is the best player to ever play for the Falcons. Went toe-to-toe with AB for a number of years for best receiver in the NFL at one time. Claude Humphrey is my number 2. He had 7 10-plus sack seasons with the Falcons. He was a defensive rookie of the year. He was a multi-time All-Pro and played as a member on one of the most underrated defenses of all time, the Grits Blitz there in the 70s. So Claude Humphrey, just incredible sack numbers, high-end pass rusher for the Falcons franchise. Matt Ryan is my number 3, which was a difficult one because obviously he's a quarterback, but is he like, where do you put him on the list? But obviously Matty Ice, as I know him, 2008 Rookie of the Year. I remember being, obviously, I think I was about 12 at this time. I remember watching Matt Ryan at Boston College and instantly being a fan of his game and thinking he was going to be a stud in the NFL. And from year 1, he was that. Exactly. Rookie of the Year in 2008. He goes on to be the MVP in 2016 and just falls short against the Patriots and Tom Brady in that 28-3 game. A lot of people remember him for that, but Matt Ryan was a true quarterback. He was a true reader of defenses, accurate quarterback. He could play in pretty much any offense in any era. He was the Falcons' leader all time in wins, and he is wins, completions, attempts, yards, touchdowns, comebacks, and game-winning drives. Matt Ryan, very, very good quarterback for a number of seasons. Deion Sanders is where he lands at number 4 here. And Deion Sanders played 5 seasons, but in those 5 seasons, he made a huge impact, and his swagger took effect on Atlanta football. I think changed Falcons football. 5 years, 2 first-team All-Pro nods as arguably the best corner in the league, if not arguably at all. He was nearly Defensive Player of the Year in 1993, where I think he officially became the locked and loaded top dog at that position in the league. And he had 7, 6, and 5 interception seasons with the Falcons. But Sanders was known for his man-to-man coverage mirror skills. He was a player that, offense simply would not even look to his side of the football. And he kind of created the shutdown corner bravado. And that is what he's known for, along with being an amazing returner of the football as well. He was at his physical peak, arguably, with the Falcons, but I think he actually got better in the following seasons with the Niners and the Cowboys in terms of pure ability as a player. But with the Falcons, he really grew into an amazing Hall of Fame, arguably the best corner of all time. Jesse Tuggle at number 5, 4-time leader in solo tackles at the linebacker position, especially in that era, extremely hard to do that many times. And then he had 5 Pro Bowl nods, and he was the leader of the 1998 defense, which ended up helping the Falcons get to the Super Bowl that season and falling short against the Denver Broncos. But nonetheless, a successful career and a heck of a tackler. At number 6, Michael Vick. Michael Vick is on this list because he changed the NFL in a number of different ways. He changed the Atlanta Falcons franchise, the popularity of football in Atlanta. He changed the way that people could market the black quarterback, in my opinion. He became arguably the most electrifying football player to exist on earth at that time. And every single kid growing up alongside them at recess playing football, which I used to do every day, people would not be saying, I want to be Peyton Manning. They were saying, I want to be Michael Vick. And so I think that generation that grew up with Michael Vick, he is an icon in a different type of way that if you did not watch football at that time, or you did not grow up with Michael Vick as an Atlanta Falcon specifically, it was the whole culture of rap and all that stuff and hip-hop kind of morphed into a player that played football. It was a very weird thing, but it was true. And so that is why he belongs on this list. Not necessarily because of his achievements, although his achievements might have been a tad underrated. He had a top 5 MVP voting season twice in his Falcons career. And he did make it to 3 Pro Bowls as a Falcon and 1 NFC title appearance, on top of pretty much smashing rushing records at the time for the quarterback position. So those are the top 6 Falcons of all time. The Baltimore Ravens had a very interesting list because I actually got to see all these players play. And because their franchise was generated and formed when I was born, so I was able to actually see all these players play for the Baltimore Ravens. At number 1, it is clearly and without a doubt Ray Lewis. If you say anything else, I know that Ed Reed's phenomenal, and we'll get to him in a second. Ray Lewis is the picture that you think of when you think of the Baltimore Ravens. You think of defense. You think of ferocious toughness. You think of beating people up. You think of like just the energy, the passion, the even to a certain degree personality of Ray Lewis, who I think actually brought some of that personality to the defensive side of the ball in terms of having character and actually, being a character alongside being a phenomenal player. But 3-time tackle leader in the NFL, 7-time Defensive Player of the Year vote getter, a 2-time Defensive Player of the Year winner, which is really hard nowadays to actually win that award at middle linebacker. But Ray was able to accomplish that twice. He was a 7-time first-team All-Pro and a 2-time Super Bowl champion, along with a Super Bowl MVP in 2000. More so for the body of work of that 2000 defense that was arguably the best defense that we have ever seen in NFL history. One of the most underrated defenses of all time is the 2006 Baltimore Ravens defense, which was unbelievable. And, pretty much any defense that Ray Lewis played on was historic because he was that good, he was that smart, and he was able to actually go toe-to-toe with the field generals of the era, being Peyton Manning, Tom Brady especially, but also guys like Drew Brees, and even, some great quarterbacks in his own division, like Carson Palmer, Ben Roethlisberger, etc. So Ray Lewis, unbelievable player. In my opinion, the greatest middle linebacker of all time. At number 2, Ed Reed. In my opinion, probably the greatest free safety in NFL history. So Ray Lewis is phenomenal. Ed Reed is also unbelievable. And I know that Bill Belichick and Tom Brady feared facing this guy because not only was he so physically gifted with his range, his ability to cover so much space and so much ground, and his knack for seeing the game in such a unique fashion. He could read things and see things and study things at a unique rate. And then also, he could do everything well. Like, he could knock your head off. People will forget about Ed Reed's ability to not only cover, but hit people. And that was back when you could still hit, right? But he was a 3-time interception leader, the 2004 Defensive Player of the Year, and honestly surprised he didn't have more Defensive Player of the Year accolades. But part of the problem with Ed Reed is he shared the spotlight with Ray Lewis. 5-time All-Pro and a 1-time Super Bowl winner on that 2012 team, which I believe was his last game to play for the Ravens, if I'm not mistaken. But yeah, Ed Reed, in my opinion, just no better free safety in the history of the NFL. Jonathan Ogden is my number 3, a 9-time All-Pro, first-team All-Pro, unbelievable left tackle. And, you know, you think of the early draft classes of this team, Ogden was one of those staples. He is arguably the best modern tackle, and what I mean by that is like 2000s era tackle of like that we've ever seen. And he was a Pro Bowler every single season except for his rookie season. At number 4, Lamar Jackson. Yes, Lamar belongs at number 4 because he is a 2-time NFL MVP. He has created a new era of Raven football that is separate from the Ray Lewis era. A 2-time All-Pro, a 1-time touchdown leader, 2 1,000-yard rushing seasons, which is rare in the NFL ever. The only other guy to really accomplish that is Michael Vick, and I believe maybe Justin Fields has one. I don't even think Randall Cunningham has one, but 3-time yards per attempt leader on top of that. People say he can't throw, though. In a 58-19 record, Lamar Jackson has been the modern Michael Vick, an extremely electric playmaker, and continues to shine. I think he's only like 28 years old. He's going to have a few more years to build this legacy, hopefully be able to raise that Lombardi trophy, which is the only thing he really hasn't accomplished at this level or at this rate, and he's well on his way to becoming a Hall of Famer. At number 5, Terrell Suggs, one of my personal favorite players that I ever watched on defense. Terrell Suggs, just the definition of an edge rusher. Huge human that was more powerful than anybody. He was thick. He had the biggest head you've ever seen in your life, and he would terrorize opponents. Defensive Player of the Year in 2011, where he had 14 sacks and 7 forced fumbles, which led the NFL. In 2003, he was the Defensive Rookie of the Year, and at that time, it was just, how do you even stop the Ravens defense? You've got Ray Lewis, you've got Ed Reed, and now Terrell Suggs. 12 sacks as a rookie, and he was a Super Bowl champion in 2012. I think there was a moment, although a lot of people would not really give it the recognition it deserves. Suggs was the best player on that defense for a couple of years. And again, because of Ray Lewis and Ed Reed, I don't think he was really given the correct respect at that level, but unbelievable player, could play the run, could play the pass, was a great power player. Terrell Suggs at number 5. Justin Tucker is my number 6 because I think there's an argument that he's the greatest player to ever play his position of kicker. He is a 3-time field goals made leader, a 4-time All-Pro, and a 1-time field goal percentage leader in his career. He's also a Super Bowl champion and has been probably regarded as the best kicker in the NFL for at least 10 years. So, you know, pretty darn good football player in my opinion. The Buffalo Bills have one of the coolest lists in my opinion, because it's pretty much all offense, and then their best player is a defensive player. Bruce Smith, everyone thinks of Aaron Donald nowadays. They think of Reggie White. They think of Lawrence Taylor. But the guy that doesn't get brought up enough is Bruce Smith. 2-time Defensive Player of the Year, 14 and a half playoff sacks in 20 games, and 171 sacks with Buffalo. I believe he is still the all-time leader in sacks in NFL history. He's a 9-time top 5 in Defensive Player of the Year voting 9 times, guys. Some people don't even play 9. There's guys on this list that have not even played 9 years in their career. 9 times top 5 defensive player in the NFL, and 2 times he finished second. So he could have easily won 4 Defensive Player of the Year awards. At number 2, O.J. Simpson. Highly controversial, but I have to include him if I want to talk about the full history of the Buffalo Bills, because before Jim Kelly, before Thurman Thomas and Andre Reed and the 90s Bills, and before Josh Allen, long before, O.J. Simpson was by far the most iconic Buffalo Bill and the only thing anyone would ever talk about when it came to the Buffalo Bills. And he was one of, if not at one time, considered the greatest running back or the second greatest running back to ever play the sport. 5 straight all-pro seasons, the best running back in the NFL during the middle of the 70s, 72 to 76, which was peak for running backs, I would say. Like 70s, 80s, 90s are the peaks of running backs, and OJ was the best for about 5 years. 2,000 yards in 14 games. Still, I don't understand how that even happens. That's 1973, where he was the MVP of the NFL, a 4-time rushing leader, and he finished top 4 in MVP votes 4 times. So O.J. Simpson, incredible football player. At number 3, Jim Kelly. The crazy thing about Jim Kelly that people don't understand, especially young people, is that he started his career for the Bills at 26 years old because he previously played in a different league. So he did not actually play in the NFL until 26. Another thing that's underrated about Jim Kelly is just how much winning he did. He had 101 wins in his career, only 59 losses. He was an All-Pro in 1991. He led the NFL in touchdowns, rating, and completion percentage 1 time throughout his career. He had 4 12-win seasons, which is hard to do, and 4 Super Bowl appearances. 4. He was by far, the most dominant AFC quarterback at the beginning of the 90s, and probably the best AFC quarterback in the 90s for at least half the decade. 2 times top 5 in MVP. Jim Kelly, did this in Dan Marino's division. Just think of that for a second. So, great player, Jim Kelly. Thurman Thomas, in my opinion, was the engine of that offense in Buffalo in the 90s. 2-time All-Pro, 8 1,000-yard rushing seasons in a row. 8, okay? Then, what else? An MVP in 1991, and you think to that iconic game plan that Bill Belichick had in the Super Bowl for the Giants to outlast and beat the Bills, thanks to Norwood's miss. I'm sorry, Bills fans. But Belichick basically dialed in on Thurman Thomas and said, we've got to slow him down in the passing game. We've got to actually let him run the ball, because if we don't, then they're going to throw it all over us. That was something to the degree of the game plan. And just to slow them down, we actually had to let Thurman Thomas go off because we weren't going to stop him anyways. So they led the NFL in scrimmage yards 4 years in a row, did Thurman Thomas. Unbelievable running back in the run and the passing game, and was kind of one of those originators of that. Andre Reed, 7 straight Pro Bowls. The Bills triplet member with 4 1,000-yard seasons, led the NFL in yards per touch in 1994. I always remember Andre Reed when I was playing, what was the game? 2K8 Pro Football, 2K8, when they couldn't come out with a game. I used to always have Andre Reed on my team, bro. So shout out to Andre Reed for playing on my teams. That's an underrated game, by the way. Josh Allen. The great Josh Allen, currently playing for the Buffalo Bills, one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL today, is also the honorable mention on my Bills all-time list. He will make his way up this list. I would not be shocked at all if he surpassed Jim Kelly one day. 3 top 5 MVP finishes. He has won 63 games already and has only lost 30 games as a starter. 4 straight 40-plus touchdown seasons, which nobody has accomplished, including Patrick Mahomes, in this era. 21 touchdowns to 4 picks in the playoffs. Josh Allen is an absolute beast. He can run you over. He's got the strongest arm you maybe ever seen. He breaks sacks left and right. He extends plays, and he is one of the most exciting quarterbacks to ever watch in the history of the NFL. That's the Buffalo Bills list. The Carolina Panthers. I also got the fortune of seeing all of these players play live. Number 1, Steve Smith. Steve Smith was actually, believe it or not, an all-pro punt returner before he ever became an all-pro wide receiver. He was an all-pro punt returner in 2001. He was the 7-time 1,000-yard receiver. 2005 season, I always think back of watching Steve Smith like, this guy's unstoppable. I don't know. Nobody can stop Steve Smith in 2005. A triple crown winner. That means receptions, yards, and touchdowns. Led the NFL in all 3 categories. And in the 2003 playoffs, in which the Panthers were able to get to the Super Bowl and lose to the Patriots, Steve Smith was also unstoppable. 404 yards and 3 touchdowns in that playoff run. Steve Smith was the little man that could. He was the guy that just, like, every level of the field, early in his career, was an excellent deep threat, grew into an intermediate and short threat. He could take a screen. He could take a slant. He was vicious at the line of scrimmage. He was tough as nails. He would trash talk you. Steve Smith's by far the greatest player to ever play for the Carolina Panthers in terms of what he means to that team, that franchise, that is a young franchise, but then also just his mentality. At number 2, the unfortunate short career of Luke Kuechly, who could have easily been one of the top couple of linebackers that we've ever seen in the NFL. Defensive Rookie of the Year, Defensive Player of the Year in back-to-back seasons, I believe. A 2-time tackle leader, a 5-time All-Pro, never less in his entire career than a second-team All-Pro nod. He was that good, and one of the best coverage players I've ever seen at linebacker. The ability to read and react to quarterbacks was unbelievable, and then his ability to sniff out the run game. His ability to study offenses and pick up on things on the fly is very, very reminiscent of a Ray Lewis. Julius Peppers. I don't know why I keep going with the Jabril. I guess he's on my Patriots, but Julius Peppers was the real Peppers. First 8 years in Carolina, he spent there in Carolina because he ended up going on playing for Chicago, Green Bay, all these different teams. But Peppers was a Carolina Panther. Defensive Rookie of the Year in 2002. He had 6 10-plus sack seasons with just the Panthers in 8 years and had 30 forced fumbles, 6 picks, and 2 touchdowns. Just an unbelievable player. Like, do you just realize what I just said? He had 6 interceptions. He's about 6'5", 280 pounds. He's a defensive end, and he had 2 touchdowns, 6 picks, 30 forced fumbles, and 6 10-plus sack seasons. Cam Newton is my number 4. Cam Newton is one of the most unique personalities and players in NFL history. A behemoth of a quarterback who would run you over for 58 rushing touchdowns in Carolina. One of the most dominant MVP seasons with very little around you that we've ever seen in 2015. A dominant force that was taking over the NFL and culture at the time that season. His touchdown celebrations are iconic. The entire thing was just so much fun to watch. But an incredible 2015 Offensive Player of the Year, MVP, Offensive Rookie of the Year in 2011, coming from Auburn straight to the NFL and dominating in his first 2 games, throwing for 400 yards in his first 2 games. I mean, Cam Newton was just a specimen. It's just those type of guys just don't last very long in the NFL because they're just so physically built. It's hard at that when you take that many hits and things to be able to take that wear and tear. But Cam at his peak was incredibly fun to watch. Greg Olsen at number 5, 14, 15, and 16. 2014, 15, and 16. 3 straight 1,000-yard seasons, 3 Pro Bowls, 2 second-team All-Pro seasons. Greg Olsen was an absolute technician at the tight end position. Always had the talent, always had the speed, always had the athleticism, but he really grew into an extremely savvy and smart tight end that became Cam Newton's number 1 option. Jake Delhomme is my honorable mention. This one was difficult, but Jake Delhomme highly gets overlooked, so that's why I put him on the list. 0-3 Super Bowl appearance. He was able to come out of nowhere, undrafted guy. I believe he was Arena League guy, something like that. He was able to come into the NFL and be like simply one of the toughest quarterbacks from the pocket that you've ever seen, making big time throws down the field in the Super Bowl against the Patriots to keep them in it toe-to-toe with Tom Brady. Led the NFL in game-winning drives and comebacks 2 different times. He actually had 3 10-plus winning seasons. It wasn't just the 2003 season. 2005, Carolina was one of the best teams in the NFL. 2008, he had a big comeback player of the year type of season, and he was 53-37 in his career. Jake Delhomme, when he played for that short span of like 03 to 08 in Carolina, had many good seasons there, and I think a pretty underrated quarterback. So that's my Carolina Panthers list. The Chicago Bears. The Bears are up next. The Bears. And at number 1, you've got to go with Walter Payton. I think there's a debate here for Dick Butkus versus Walter Payton, but I'm going with sweetness all the way. I think there is an argument that Walter Payton is the greatest running back of all time, simply because he was so tough. His agility was unbelievable. His ability to make people miss in tight spaces, his ability to contort his body and be able to convert short yardage plays into first downs, touchdowns, his ability to catch the football. He did everything well. He was an absolute longevity monster as well. He led the NFL in attempts 4 straight years at the beginning of his career. He was the 1976 MVP. He won the Super Bowl with the Bears in 1985. He was a 5-time first-team All-Pro. Walter Payton is extremely, extremely motivating and one of the figures of the running back position in NFL history. Dick Butkus is number 2. Dick Butkus was a 5-time All-Pro. And as a rookie, Dick Butkus was instantly one of the best players in football. He had 5 interceptions and 7 fumble recoveries in his first season in the NFL. He actually had 4 seasons in which he got an MVP vote. Not just one, but he was top 5 in MVP votes as a middle linebacker 4 times. Dick Butkus was an MVP because he was the most feared player maybe in NFL history. He would destroy. I don't think the youngins understand what I am saying. He would destroy you. If you were not looking, you would maybe not make it to another game in your life. So you had to be aware of Dick Butkus on every single play. That's why he's at number 2. At number 3, the short-lived career of Gale Sayers, who was arguably the most electric runner, no matter it be a return or a run in NFL history. From 1965 to 1969, Gale Sayers electrified the NFL as the best running back in football. He was top 5 in MVP votes 5 times. He led the NFL in rushing twice. He led the NFL in all-purpose yards 3 years, right at the beginning of his career. Gale Sayers, just look up his highlights. All he need was just that little bit of daylight. All right. At number 4, Mike Singletary, 7-time first-team All-Pro. Every single season from 84 to 89, he was a first-team All-Pro. He led the best defense, arguably in NFL history, the 1985 Bears, and was probably the leader of the best defense as well of that era. And, on top of that, 2-time Defensive Player of the Year, no big deal, in 1985 and 1988. One of the most cerebral and smart and savvy linebackers of all time. One of the loudest mouths at the linebacker position of all time as well. At number 5, Sid Luckman. For many, 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 many years, still the greatest Chicago Bears quarterback we have ever seen. 5-time All-Pro. An NFL leader in touchdowns and yards 3 times each, 4 championships in the early days of the NFL, and he led the NFL in yards per punt. Let me say that again. Sid Luckman led the NFL in yards 3 times, touchdowns 3 times, and yards per punt in 1939. Just a great football player. I saw that. And then on top of that, he had a pretty iconic game in there as well, if you know what I'm saying. At number 6, Brian Urlacher is my honorable mention. I just couldn't have a list growing up when I grew up without Brian Urlacher. I just couldn't do it. I'm sorry. Some other people might have a different player here, but Urlacher is a Hall of Famer. The 2000 Defensive Rookie of the Year, the 2005 Defensive Player of the Year. And the unique thing about Urlacher, he was not only a great 4-3 middle linebacker who could play in the cover 2 defense and drop back into coverage, but he was also a great pass rusher because he played defensive end, or he played safety, I believe, in college, but he could have played defensive end. He was about 6'5", right? So he had huge size. He had 8 sacks and 6 sacks in the 2 seasons in which he had Defensive Rookie of the Year and Defensive Player of the Year. So he could sack the quarterback as well as play in a cover 2 system, which is very unique. 4-time All-Pro and the second best linebacker in the 2000s, in my opinion, having seen the era behind Ray Lewis. So that is the Chicago Bears list. The Cincinnati Bengals are up next. Anthony Munoz is number 1. 9-time first-team All-Pro. Many people would say is the greatest left tackle in NFL history. I don't have to say much more. 9-time first-team All-Pro. Went to 2 Super Bowls in his era. And 11 Pro Bowls. So Anthony Munoz, you pretty much weren't getting a sack if you were rushing against him in any game. At number 2, the great, the iconic, and one of my favorite players of all time, Chad Ochocinco Johnson, the 2-time All-Pro, 6-time Pro Bowler, led the NFL in yards in 2006, had 4 90-plus catch seasons, 4 seasons of 1,300 yards, first in yards, catches, and touchdowns throughout his career in different seasons, all in different seasons, I believe. Chad Johnson was the most fun to watch. His interviews, the build-up to every game, which corner he was playing, he had the checklist, the touchdown celebration. There was a stretch of about 3 or 4 years where you had to know what Chad Johnson was doing. And for many people, he is the most iconic Bengal of all time, the guy that they think of when they think of the Bengals because of how entertaining he was. But he was also an incredible player, one of the quickest route runners we have ever seen. At number 3, Ken Anderson, who's probably the most underrated quarterback in NFL history, if I had to say. He was the 1981 NFL MVP. He led the NFL in yards twice, passer rating 4 times, and completions twice. Also completion percentage 3 times. So that's a lot of different categories that he led the NFL in. He was the figurehead of a different version of the West Coast offense of the early days before the San Francisco 49ers kind of took it in their direction. But Anderson was extremely accurate, calculated, and could get the ball where it needed to go in the Bengals offense. A.J. Green is my number 4. A.J. Green was an awesome player. I would say he was a top 3 receiver in his time there for a few years. 6 out of 7 of his first seasons had 1,000 yards. 7-time Pro Bowler. Second in yards, catches, and touchdowns behind Chad Johnson in Cincinnati history. Geno Atkins, 8-time Pro Bowler, 2-time first-team All-Pro. A player that I feel like played recently but is also somewhat forgotten for some reason. He had 5 9+ sack seasons, and he was an all-2010s player. And to have 5 9+ sack seasons as a defensive tackle in this NFL, that speaks to how good he was as a pass rusher. So Geno Atkins at number 5. My honorable mention was Boomer Esiason. I would not say that he is the 6th best player in Bengals history, but just in terms of what he meant, being a leader to another Super Bowl appearance in, I believe, 1988. He was the 1988 MVP of the NFL, and at one time was an excellent quarterback. He led the NFL in passer rating, yards per attempt, comebacks at one time in the NFL, and he was a 4-time Pro Bowler. So he had a nice little stretch there in the late 80s, early 90s, where Boomer, took over for Ken Anderson and became the guy in Cincinnati. So That is my top 6 list. The Cleveland Brownies are up next. Of course, number 1 is Jim Brown. Who else would it be? Jim Brown's stats are so crazy that they don't even make sense. Not only is he arguably the greatest laxer of all time, but he is also the greatest Brown of all time. Jim Brown played 9 seasons in the NFL, which is not that long. But in those 9 seasons, guys, he led the NFL in rushing 8 times. 8 out of 9 seasons, he led the NFL in rushing. He had led the NFL in rushing 5 times in touchdowns. He was the Rookie of the Year. He was a 2-time MVP. And 5 other seasons, again, guys, he won the MVP twice. In 5 other seasons, he only played 9 years. So 7 times he was top 5 in MVP votes. And he was a running back. And his best year, in my opinion, of his entire career statistically, he didn't even win the MVP. He finished second. I don't know who won the MVP, but I don't really understand why he didn't win it. Anyways, I wasn't there in the 60s. But, yeah, Jim Brown. Best running back ever? Maybe. Otto Graham is my number 2. I often cite how great Otto Graham was in as many times as I can because people don't understand it because they weren't there, 99% of my audience. So I have to give a little bit of a report. And with Otto Graham, he was, I think a lot of people would say, in the 40s playing quarterback, you would not expect a guy to be that good of an athlete. But Otto Graham was actually a running back in college. So people, he could throw the football if you watch his highlights. But if you watch him, he's also really athletic, which makes me believe that Otto Graham would have been a great player even today. But he led the NFL in yards 5 times as a quarterback. Touchdowns 3 times, passer rating 4 times, 6-time All-Pro, 7-time champion in only 10 years. So he has as many championships as the great Tom Brady. Now, there wasn't as much competition back then, but 7-time champion speaks volumes. At number 3, Joe Thomas, going back to the modern era, 10-time Pro Bowler, 6-time All-Pro, 2nd in Offensive Rookie of the Year in 2007, which is outrageous as an offensive lineman to be 2nd in Offensive Rookie of the Year votes. Think about that for a second. Never missed a game until his final season. So he played, 10 years? And he didn't miss a game until his last season. Joe Thomas was one of those guys that because he played on the worst franchise in the NFL, people kind of didn't really recognize how amazing he was until he retired. That's kind of the way his career was. Ozzie Newsome at tight end, 2 1,000-yard seasons, 2 89-catch seasons. That is really incredible for the era he was playing in as a tight end. Very rarely would those guys catch 89 passes. Very rarely would they catch 1,000 yards, okay? I think there might have been 1 or 2 seasons previously to Ozzie Newsome where a guy caught 1,000 yards, okay? All 80s team, 4-time second-team All-Pro, 1 first-team All-Pro, the all-time Browns leader in yards. People probably don't know that. And 300-plus catch lead in receptions. So he's by far the highest reception total and the all-time yards leader for the Browns in their history still. And he was a tight end in the 80s. At number 5, Myles Garrett, who's already making this list with 6 10-plus sack seasons, Defensive Player of the Year this past year in 2023. He could arguably have another one as well. He's been one of the best defensive players in the NFL for a number of seasons. 3-time All-Pro, and he's only 28 years old. He's going to stack up some more. I wouldn't be shocked if he got to 10 sack seasons in his career. He is that good. Marion Motley is the honorable mention. A lot of people will not know who Marion Motley is, but he was on the NFL all-time, 100 team, the NFL top 100 players of all time, and he is a Hall of Fame fullback. He was a 2-time yards leader, 2-time All-Pro. He ended his career with an average of 5.7 yards per carry, which is outrageous for a fullback, especially of his era. And Joe Perry once called him the greatest all-around football player that ever played. Marion Motley would block really well, especially I think when Jim Brown got there, if I'm not mistaken, he ended up being the guy that would often block for him, but he was also one of the best running backs in the NFL. So he was just that good at football to where he could do whatever they wanted him to do. Paul Brown wanted him to do. Next up, the Dallas Cowboys, which had one of the most difficult lists to make on the entire thing. I mean, they have so many Hall of Fame players. It's absolutely outrageous. But I ended up going with Roger Staubach as my number one. And I'm a little bit biased. I think Roger Staubach is my favorite Cowboy of all time. And whenever I think of the Cowboys, I think of Roger Staubach. He's Captain America, right? And he's everything that the Cowboys should be. And to me, I think that Roger Staubach is not often enough put into the conversation as the greatest quarterback or one of the greatest quarterbacks ever. And part of it is because he had to miss the first few years of his career because he was in the Navy. And so he was a little bit older when he was actually playing. But he was a 6-time Pro Bowler, and his record speaks for itself, 85-29. He was a 2-time yards per attempt leader, a 3-time interception percentage leader, a 4-time rating leader. And I don't know how he wasn't the 1971 MVP, considering in that regular season, they did not lose a game when he played. And then he also won 2 Super Bowls. So Roger Staubach, he could scramble, he could run, he could extend plays in a fashion that was unique for his era. He had a very strong arm. He was tough. He was a great leader. He's everything that a quarterback was supposed to be. And I think the first time in NFL history, there was a quarterback that really not only like looked the part of a leader and a quarterback and was the part, but also like was athletic too. Like not only smart, but athletic. Like the guys before him were very smart, but oftentimes not as athletic. And Staubach kind of put those pieces together. At number 2, I have Emmitt Smith, who for some might be the greatest running back of all time due to his production, which was outrageous. Obviously, the most rushing yards in NFL history speaks for itself, but a 4-time rushing leader, a 4-time All-Pro, a 3-time touchdown leader, a 1990 Rookie of the Year, a 1993 MVP, 3 Super Bowl rings, and 11 1,000-yard seasons in Dallas. 11, because he also played at the end of his career with, I believe, the Cardinals. But Emmitt Smith is just like, I think people don't understand Emmitt Smith to a certain degree because he's not as flashy as other running backs, but his toughness, you know, there were games where he would play with separated, there was a game he played in, I think in the playoffs with a separated shoulder, you know, and he's a running back. There's games where it's not flashy, but he was able to get the short yardage, his vision, his ability to cut back and see lanes. And yes, he had a great offensive line, but he maximized everything in that offense, and he was the best player on that offense. Then you have Bob Lilly, who was an all-time defensive tackle, Super Bowl champion, 11-time Pro Bowler, 7-time All-Pro, 4 times he received MVP votes as a defensive tackle, and he is known as Mr. Cowboy. All 60s and all 70s defensive tackle. At number 4, Larry Allen, arguably the most powerful offensive lineman to ever play the all 90s and 2000s decade teams. Allen is regarded as one of the physically strongest players at any position ever. 10 Pro Bowlers, Pro Bowl appearances, and 6 All-Pro seasons. Larry Allen is an absolute beast and cleared the way for Emmitt Smith. Randy White, 9-time Pro Bowler, another defensive tackle, by the way. 9-time Pro Bowler, 7-time All-Pro, 6-time top 4 in Defensive Player of the Year votes, 111 sacks in his career. That's 3rd in Cowboys history. Randy White was in that weird era where the Cowboys, I don't think, won any Super Bowls, but they were a pretty good team. Randy White was by far their best player, and you know, the All-Pro 7 times speaks for itself, but he was one of the best defensive players for a number of years in the NFL. Troy Aikman is the figurehead of the 90s dynasty in Dallas, the most wins in Cowboys history as a quarterback, the 2nd most yards, and 5 double-digit win seasons in a row is something to marvel at. 3 Super Bowls in 4 years, 11-4 in the playoffs, which is a great record in the playoffs. Troy Aikman, often did not have to carry the team on his right arm, but he oftentimes had to make a lot of clutch throws, and he was able to do that. He was also a great leader for the Dallas Cowboys in their second dynasty, I guess you would call it. So the Dallas Cowboys. Then we have the Denver Broncos. John Elway is easily number one. I don't think anyone thinks of the Denver Broncos and doesn't think of John Elway first, but John Elway, 5 Super Bowl appearances, 2 wins at the very end of his career. He actually had 3 Super Bowl appearances already before he even won a Super Bowl, and he won his Super Bowls in the last 2 years of his career, 1997 and 1998. He was also at the peak of his powers in the 80s when he didn't really have a lot of help. And I think a lot of people will look at John Elway's stats and be like, how is this guy regarded? Like, younger people will look at his stats and be like, how is this guy regarded as one of the greatest quarterbacks? But this is one of those guys that you would have to actually watch. Like, his arm strength, his physical capabilities, he was just ridiculous with what he could do on the football field. 1987 MVP, oftentimes in playoff games, willing teams to win games through rather running the ball, throwing the ball. He had the drive against the Cleveland Browns in one of the most iconic games of the 80s. Top 5 in MVP votes 4 times. Okay, 148 regular season wins. This guy just simply won a lot of games. Like, if you want to know what made John Elway great, he won a lot, and it wasn't always with the best team around him. He won a lot. 14 playoff wins. He led the NFL in comebacks 3 different times. So, John Elway, best Bronco of all time. At number 2, I have Von Miller, which might be slightly controversial, but Von Miller is my selection because he defined an era of Broncos football, which in my opinion might have been the most dominant defense that I've ever been able to, watch for a full season. And that is the 2015 Broncos. Super Bowl 50 MVP, where he dominated the Carolina Panthers and that season's best offense in the NFL. He also was able to dominate the Patriots in the AFC Championship the game before against the greatest quarterback of all time in Tom Brady, a 3-time All-Pro, 7 10-plus sack seasons, Rookie of the Year in 2011, 2-time second in Defensive Player of the Year votes, never actually won Defensive Player of the Year. But he did have 5 sacks in 3 playoff games in 2015, and honestly, winning that Super Bowl MVP is kind of like his Defensive Player of the Year. And then at number 3, we've got Shannon Sharpe, who is one of the greatest tight ends in NFL history with 8 Pro Bowl nods, 4 All-Pros. He had 3 1,000-yard seasons, again in an era where he played mostly in the 90s, which was not too common for tight ends to be catching 1,000 yards. He was probably by far the best tight end of the 90s. If you really think about it, he had 3 80-plus catch seasons, and Sharpe retired as the NFL leader in receptions, receiving yards, and receiving touchdowns by a tight end, which I think is honestly, when you think about these stats and the way that, they evolve and the game evolves and the way that the positions evolve, like, it's hard to compare what Shannon Sharpe did to somebody like Travis Kelce. So for his ability to retire with those records, I think speaks to how good of a player he was. At number 4, Champ Bailey. Champ Bailey is one of the players that I don't think, this generation of fans would understand how much I love this player. Like, Champ Bailey was unreal. And no more did he hurt me than in the 2005 divisional round where he intercepted Tom Brady at the 1-yard line and ran the ball all the way back until Ben Watson was able to chase him down somehow, some way, running all the way across the field and knocking Champ Bailey out of bounds. But by then the game was over, and that actually gave Tom Brady his first playoff loss, and it was at the hands of Champ friggin' Bailey, who was the best cornerback in the NFL from 2004 to 2006, and I don't think it was relatively close. He was unbelievable. He led the NFL in interceptions in 2006. He was an 8-time Pro Bowler in Denver and a 3-time first-team All-Pro just in Denver. He also played in Washington. But he had man-to-man skills. He was one of the fastest players in the NFL as well. And he just had read and react skills that were off the charts. Champ Bailey is one of the greatest corners of all time. At number 5, Terrell Davis. You have to include Terrell Davis. You can't talk about the Broncos and their Super Bowl success without Terrell Davis. Why? Because in the Super Bowl runs of the Denver Broncos in 1997 and 1998, although John Elway was the quarterback of that team, he had 8 touchdowns, guys, in the 1997 playoffs. Some running backs don't even have 8 touchdowns in a single year. He had 8 touchdowns in one playoff. And then he also had 150 yards per game in back-to-back Super Bowl seasons. 150 yards rushing in the playoffs against the best teams in the NFL in back-to-back years, not just one, both. That's how good of a playoff running back Terrell Davis was. And then he was the 1998 MVP. And if you look at his career, it was very short, which sucks. But he was top 3 in MVP votes 3 times. He won 1 MVP. And he also, when you look at his career, it escalated. So it had 1,100 yards, 1,500 yards, 1,750 yards, and then 2,000 yards. He had a 2,000-yard season. So, yeah, that Mike Shanahan zone scheme, the early days of what we now see with Kyle Shanahan's offense, Terrell Davis was the runner for that offense. Then we had Steve Atwater, a all-time safety with 8 Pro Bowls, 2 All-Pros, an all-90s team guy, was one of the hardest hitters in NFL history, 3rd all-time in Broncos tackles as well, and 2 Super Bowl rings at the end of the 90s. So a lot of 90s members making it in there. For the Denver Broncos, the Detroit Lions, one of my favorite lists to make is the Detroit Lions, because the Lions do not have the greatest history of team success, but they have a lot of great players. And actually, they did have a lot of winning success early in their days in the early NFL. And there are many players that are not on this list that could have made the list as well, but at number 1, I've got Barry Sanders, of course. Barry Sanders is arguably the most talented running back of all time. I don't know if I could say he is the greatest, but he has a debate, definitely. And I think many people would say that he is the greatest, but I would say that he is the most talented. 10-time Pro Bowler, 6-time All-Pro. He was the Rookie of the Year and the MVP in 1997 as well. He had 2,000 yards in 1997 when he won the MVP trophy. And he was a 2-time Offensive Player of the Year as well, in one season where he didn't win the MVP and then the other when he did win the MVP. He had, guys, this is the craziest stat you'll ever hear when it comes to a running back. He had less than 1,300 yards in his entire career one time. In the NFL right now, if you get 1,300 yards, you probably lead the NFL in rushing yards. Barry Sanders played for 10 years and had less than 1,300 yards once. And it's not like he played on great teams either. And he led the NFL in rushing yards 4 different times. So Barry Sanders, just the most exciting running back you'll ever watch. Shifty, his maneuverability, his ability to get around people, make people miss, stop on a dime, change directions. I've seen his highlights a million times. Calvin Johnson at number 2. 2-time yards leader, 1-time reception leader, 1-time touchdown leader, 1,964 yards. I almost said in 1964. Obviously, Megatron did not play in 1964. Maybe the Decepticon did, but at 1,964 yards is something that a Transformer would actually do in one NFL season, 2012, where I would make an argument that out of all the seasons I've seen from wide receivers, that the greatest receiver I've ever seen in my entire life is 2012 Calvin Johnson. There are games where Matthew Stafford would throw him the ball into quadruple coverage and he would catch it. Like, I don't even know how that happened, but 2011, 2012 Calvin Johnson was unbelievable. 3-time All-Pro, all-time Lions leader in receiving. And yeah, he was, for a short stint of his career, one of the most, handful of names, one of the most dominant players we've ever seen at that position. Joe Schmidt is at number 3. The linebacker was an 8-time All-Pro. He had a season with 8 fumble recoveries and one other season with 6 interceptions. So he had versatility to his game even in that era. 2 seasons where he was top 5 in MVP votes as a linebacker. 2 championships with the Lions, and played 155 games with the Detroit Lions franchise. Jack Christensen is up next as a safety, 2-time interception leader. One season, he had 12 picks with 298 yards in returns. I don't know if I've ever seen anyone have 300 yards in returns. So when I saw that number from Jack Christensen, I was like, have I ever seen 298 yards in returns in which none of his returns went for a touchdown? He had 298 yards. And then 6 times he was an All-Pro as a safety, one of the greatest lines of all time. Lem Barney, who's also a shout out to the old All-Pro 2008 game, which he was in, I remember. 10 interceptions, led the NFL in one season. He also had seasons of 7, 8, and 7 interceptions. That was just to start his career. 10, 7, 8, 7 to start his career. And then, one of the best corners in the NFL, like right as he started, he might have been the best corner in the NFL for about a 4 or 5 year stretch. And he was the Rookie of the Year. He had 3 pick sixes in that Rookie of the Year season, and he was known for pick sixes, and 2-time All-Pro. So Lem Barney, all-time Hall of Fame corner. Bobby Lane, the greatest quarterback in Lions history, in my opinion, surpassing even Matthew Stafford, and still to this day, I think the greatest of all time. 80-48 was his record, a 2-time yards leader, 5-time yards per completion leader, and 4 years in a row, top 3 in MVP votes, and 2 championships that he brought to Detroit. So just because he played a long time ago, Bobby Lane, he had a significant impact on the beginning of the Lions franchise. And many of these players were very, very, very good in that era, but especially the defense. But Bobby Lane led the way for the offense, being one of the best quarterbacks of his era. So that's the Lions list. Up next, we've got the Green Bay Packers. The Green Bay Packers are up next. And man, the Green Bay Packers, I went with Brett Favre as the greatest player in Green Bay Packer history. The Iron Man, Brett Favre. 1995 to 1997, Brett Favre is one of the greatest primes in NFL history. 1 Super Bowl ring, 3 straight MVPs. He led the NFL all 3 years in touchdowns, had 1 losing season in his entire Packer career. 16 years he played for the Green Bay Packers. And in only 1 season did he have a losing record. He had 9 Pro Bowls, 3 All-Pros, and 13 playoff wins. So, he had just as many Super Bowls as Aaron Rodgers. He did have 1 less MVP, but I feel like his prime was greater with the 3 straight MVP trophies, which I don't think has been accomplished otherwise in the NFL. And he was just unbelievable. And when you think of the Packers, you think of the spirit. You think of the energy. You think of the youthfulness of Brett Favre. That's what I think of. I think of Brett Favre slinging the rock, bro. Aaron Rodgers is at number 2, though. A 4-time NFL MVP with the Packers, a 1-time Super Bowl champion, a 2-time touchdown leader with 40+ in both of those seasons, a 4-time passer rating leader, only 3 losing seasons, but 2 more than Brett Favre. 11-10 in the playoffs, not quite as many playoff wins as Brett Favre. 48, this is where he gets Brett Favre. This is insane, okay? He has 3 different seasons where it doesn't even make sense how good his touchdown to interception ratio is, and it's a majority of his career, but 48 touchdowns to 5 interceptions in a year is insane. 37 touchdowns to 4 interceptions is insane, and 40 touchdowns to 7 interceptions is insane. He had a number of seasons where you're like, how do you even throw that many touchdowns without throwing any interceptions? But that's what Aaron Rodgers did. He's so accurate, great arm, ability to move around and throw off different platforms, and he kind of changed the quarterback position in a lot of different ways. And we see that his impact has really had a huge impact on a lot of passers in this era. Don Hutson, some people would say the greatest receiver in NFL history, especially of that era. 7-time yards leader, 8-time All-Pro, 9-time touchdown leader, which is insane. 1,211 yards in 11 games in 1942. That's just insanity. In 1942, he had 1,211 yards in 11 games. What? And he also won 3 championships. So Don Hutson was like dominant in his era, but like unthinkably dominant. He kind of like created his own wide receiver position. Bart Starr is my number 4, who's oftentimes now the forgotten quarterback of the Packers' history, but he actually has the most championships by a wide margin. He was also a good player, a 4-time passer rating leader and completion percentage leader, 2-time yards per attempt leader. He was 9-1 in the playoffs. He only lost 1 playoff game in his entire life. And he had 5 Super Bowl rings, or 5 rings and 2 Super Bowl rings, I should say. So 3 championships plus 2 Super Bowls. And then in the playoffs, he had 15 touchdowns to only 3 interceptions. So he was really good in the clutch. When they asked him to throw, he performed. Willie Davis is my number 5, the greatest pass rush specialist in Packers history, but really good defensive player. 5-time All-Pro, 5 Super Bowl rings, 5 rings, again, championships, 4 sacks in the 67 playoffs to get himself a Super Bowl ring, 5 10-plus sack seasons, and these were in 14-game seasons as well. So Willie Davis, absolute stud for the Lombardi Packers. Forrest Gregg, he was one of the greatest tackles of all time in the Lombardi sweep system, where they used to run that old-fashioned zone blocking, get out in front type of system. Forrest Gregg had 7-time All-Pro seasons, and then 193 games he played for the Green Bay Packers, playing a then league record 188 consecutive games in 16 seasons from 1956 until 1971. Forrest Gregg, one of the greatest left tackles in NFL history. The Packers got some great players, man. The Packers got some great players. The Houston Texans are up next. The Houston Texans, their greatest player, and this is obviously the latest franchise in NFL history. So they only have existed for like 20 years. I don't even know if they've existed that long. So a lot of these players are modern, of course. J.J. Watt, by far, like not even close, the best Houston Texan of all time. I would make an argument that at his peak, J.J. Watt might have been the best defensive player I've ever seen. He was that good. He had 5 All-Pro seasons, 3 Defensive Player of the Year seasons, 2 20.5 sack seasons, which is outrageous, 4 16-plus sack seasons. And when you really go about and look at all these different teams and all these different lists and all the different players and all the different pass rushers, 16 plus sacks, not a lot of guys actually have done. Like 16 plus it's a hard number. So like to do that 4 times is tough. To do 20 twice is crazy. So then he led the NFL in sacks 2 times, forced fumbles once, tackles for loss 3 times, and he probably could have been the 2014 MVP. But then arguably 2012 was even better for him, as he had 14 passes defensed, 20.5 sacks, and 39 tackles for loss. I don't know if I've ever seen that number. 39 tackles for loss. J.J. Watt would catch touchdowns on offense, run touchdowns back off of deflected passes, sack the quarterback, stop the run. He was a complete monster. At number 2, Andre Johnson, the best wide receiver in the NFL during 2008 and 2009 for my money. Back-to-back 1,500-yard seasons in that time. Led the NFL in yards per game 3 times in his career, receptions twice, and he had 7 1,000-yard seasons. Andre Johnson was a complete receiver because he had the size and the thickness to be able to battle at the line of scrimmage and to be able to box out corners and to be able to kind of physically manhandle cornerbacks, but he also had really good speed, really good route running. Like, his combination of that power and the speed was a very unique combination. So Andre Johnson is the number 2. At number 3, DeAndre Hopkins, who has some of the best hands in NFL history. 3 100-catch seasons, 4 1,000-yard seasons in Houston, a 3-time All-Pro. He was a top 5 receiver at the very least from 2017 through 2019. He led the NFL in touchdowns in 2017 as well. DeAndre Hopkins just had incredible awareness of the football, the ability to play the ball, track the ball, be able to make any catch, no matter if it was contested or open. D-Hop is at number 3. At number 4, Arian Foster, a forgotten great running back of I would say the late 2000s, the early 2010s period. He was a 4-time Pro Bowler, a 1-time All-Pro, and he was the best running back in the NFL in 2010, rushing for 1,616 yards, catching 66 passes, and having 16 touchdowns. A lot of sixes there. Led the NFL in yards, touchdowns, scrimmage yards in that season, and also had 4 1,000-yard rushing seasons. His career was short, but he had great vision, and he was so smooth. He was one of the butterly smoothest running backs you will ever watch. Dwayne Brown is my number 5. Dwayne Brown was an All-Pro in 2012, a 2-time second-team All-Pro, a 3-time Pro Bowler, a first-round pick for the Texans in 2008 that definitely lived up to the hype. And according to PFF, he was a top 3 left tackle in the NFL in 2011 and 2012 per their grading. And then at number 6, the honorable mention is Deshaun Watson. I have to put Deshaun Watson here for his 3 Pro Bowl seasons, his 2 playoff seasons, rejuvenating and invigorating, I would say, the Texans franchise. Because, and he was really the first Texans quarterback that was a legit top-tier quarterback. For 3 years there, he was a top-tier quarterback, and Matt Schaub was a nice kind of system quarterback. They wanted it to be David Carr. He never lived up to the hype. Deshaun Watson was like that top tier talent who finally lived up to it for the Texans franchise. That's why he's the honorable mention. Led the league in passing yards in 2020. He was a legit, man. So, and he could run, he had more football sense to him than the current Deshaun Watson does right now in Cleveland. And that's kind of hurt his overall, legacy, even with the Texans for a lot of people. Next up, the Indianapolis Colts. Peyton Manning is number 1, although I think there is some debate that Johnny Unitas could be number 1, depending on which generation of fan you ask. But Peyton Manning is my number 1 because I got to watch Peyton Manning and I understood the fear of being the opponent, the opponent, the fan opponent, right, of facing Peyton Manning. And Peyton Manning was the guy that kind of changed the NFL in terms of taking that next step from uniquely and weirdly Johnny Unitas of the cerebral quarterback who studied the game and kind of ran his own offense, took that to the field and kind of revolutionized that. And that's where Tom Brady kind of gained that next step. Drew Brees, these other guys were able to kind of take that and really create their own thing with it. But Peyton Manning, man, was unbelievable. Like, I don't think people understand, like, especially the younger people would understand how good Peyton Manning was, because he didn't move like some of these modern quarterbacks. He didn't have the strongest arm in the world, but man, he made so many right decisions. He was always so precise with the football. His timing, everything was on the damn money. He controlled the game from start to finish. He could check into the right play in every moment's notice. He ran his own offense. He was his own offensive coordinator, and he was the best quarterback, I would say, overall from 2003 to 2009. Not to say other guys didn't have better seasons, maybe were more clutch, but Peyton Manning overall accomplished the most in that era by a wide margin. He was a 1-time Super Bowl champ, 2-time appearance guy, 4-time MVP for the Colts, 2-time yards leader, 4-time game-winning drive leader. He was expert at game-winning drives. Rating leader 3 times, 3-time touchdown leader, 5-time All-Pro, a 141-67 record. And I think even more impressively, when you look at his record in the regular season, 109 wins to 35 losses from 2002 to 2010 with the Colts. 100 wins in that era, in that time, with all those great teams. And then from 2003 to 2009, he was top 3 in MVP votes all but once. The only season he wasn't was 2007, which I think only Tom Brady and Brett Favre had votes. Tom Brady had 49, I think, and Brett Favre had 1. So, but every other year, Peyton Manning had at least top 3 MVP votes, and he won 4 of them. So he was that good. Johnny Unitas was also that good. 10-time Pro Bowler, 5-time All-Pro, 4-time yards leader, touchdown leader, ratings leader 3 times, MVP 3 times, top 3 in MVP votes 7 times. But unlike Peyton, he won more championships. He had 3 championships, 1 Super Bowl ring from 1959. Just unbelievable. 32 touchdowns to 14 interceptions in the year 1959. That would be a good season nowadays. That's like a good Peyton Manning season in 2008. Like 32 touchdowns to 14 interceptions. In 1959, that's outrageous. And so, Johnny U, I think his legacy is actually a little bit hurt because he was right before Super Bowls. So if he would have played like 10 years later, I think his legacy would actually be a lot greater than it is. Because I think there's an argument that he is the 2nd, the 3rd, or the 4th greatest quarterback of all time. Jim Parker is an all-time great Hall of Fame left tackle protecting Johnny Unitas. 8 years in a row, he was a first-team All-Pro and a Pro Bowler, an All-50s team member, and he had 2 championships to his name. Marvin Harrison is at number 4. Marvin Harrison, amazing player. 8 1,000-yard seasons in a row, 3-time All-Pro. In 2002, he had 143 catches, 2-time reception leader, 2-time yards leader, and from 1999 to 2002, he had no less than 102 catches or 1,400 yards. Think about that for a second. For 4 years, he had no less than 102 catches or 1,400 yards, and I just glossed over it, but the guy had 143 catches in one season. And in my opinion, Peyton to Marvin Harrison was the combination of the 2000s. Raymond Berry, all-time receiver in his own right. 3-time reception leader, 3-time yards leader, 2-time touchdown leader, 3-time All-Pro, 2-time champion, and clutch in the 1958 NFL championship game known as the greatest game ever played. Raymond Berry caught in 1958 12 passes for 178 yards and a touchdown. So Raymond Berry was technical, precise, unbelievable routes. He kind of was him and Unitas kind of originated the timing and the preciseness. And that's where I think Peyton partly got that with Marvin, that combination. It's something about the Colts and that quarterback to wide receiver combo, but you can't leave out John Mackey, who has the tight end award named after him, of course, in college football. But I had to include him here because when you think of the Colts, you rather think of Peyton and Marvin and Reggie Wayne and the Colts passing game, or you think of Johnny Unitas and the historic passing game and what they did to revolutionize the NFL at that time. And John Mackey was a big part of that. 3-time All-Pro, 5-time Pro Bowler, 2 times he had MVP votes as a tight end. And one of the craziest stats I saw was as a rookie, he averaged 20 yards per catch. He scored 7 touchdowns, and he also returned 9 kickoffs. Guys, this is a tight end. He returned 9 kickoffs for 271 yards, which is an average of 30 yards per return, which it would be like a record. It's up there. That's really good for a tight end. So, yeah, John Mackey was super athletic, fast guy, unbelievable athlete. The top 6 players in Jags history. Duval at number 1, Fred Taylor. Without even thinking about it, I think Fred Taylor is one of the most underrated running backs of all time. If he would have played on a bigger team, a more successful team, I think he would be a Hall of Fame player, because 7 1,000-yard seasons in Jacksonville is pretty incredible. Led the NFL in yards per game in 2000, 1,399 yards in 13 games. Only 1 Pro Bowl, which is an absolute crime for a running back that had 7 1,000-yard seasons. And he has, by a pretty wide margin, the most rushing yards in team history. Fred Taylor was fast, dude. He could break away and hit you with a home run. Jimmy Smith is my number 2. I've got him because, man, the consistency. A lot like Fred Taylor, but at wide receiver. 116 catches in 1999, led the NFL. He had a 1,600-yard season at one point, which is really, really good. Had 9 1,000-yard seasons. Pro Bowl 5 years in a row, and he is the all-time Jags leader in receptions, yards, touchdowns, all of it, okay? At number 3, Tony Boselli, who had a short-lived but Hall of Fame career. He just recently got in. 3 All-Pros, All-90s team, left tackle, very influential on the early Jags, right? Because they originated around the Carolina Panthers, I believe, at the same time, and both teams got that spark, and Boselli was probably their best player right off the jump. So 3-time All-Pro left tackle, Hall of Fame left tackle, and the most All-Pros of any Jag is Tony Boselli. Then at number 4, we've got Mark Brunell, who I always remember, like my young Mitch remembers him late in his career with the Commanders, not the Commanders, but you know what I mean. But Mark Brunell, he was actually really good for Jacksonville and the best Jacksonville quarterback of all time. In 1996, he led the NFL in yards. He was good. He was better than people would think. 1999, he led the Jags to a 13-2 record that year. He had 3 Pro Bowl nods. He had 4 consecutive playoff runs in 5 years to start the franchise off with a hot little run there. And he had the yards, touchdowns, and wins records for Jacksonville. Still, yards, touchdowns, and wins for quarterbacks. So Brunell is still the top quarterback in franchise history. Maurice Jones-Drew is my number 5. He led the NFL in rushing in 2011. This is a guy that I definitely recall as one of the weirdest looking running backs. He's like 5'6", but he was a fridge, and he was also quick and explosive. He could hit a home run. He could run you over in the hole. He was short-lived a little bit, but really, really good at his peak. Led the NFL in rushing yards in 2011, all-pro season that year, 3 straight Pro Bowls, 3 straight 1,300-yard seasons, 3 12-plus rushing touchdown seasons, and he was actually, and still is, 4th in receiving yards in Jags history. So he also caught the ball a little bit more than I even thought. So MJD is number 5. And at number 6, this is a little bit of a kind of like a projection, some sort. But I think in the next year or two, Josh Allen will become a top 5 player in this franchise's history. He just signed a fresh new contract to certify that he'll be there. But 2 Pro Bowls already. He did have a 17.5 sack season in 2023, which is one of the best sacking seasons in Jags history. He has 2 10-plus sack seasons, and he's already second in sacks in Jags history, and he's only 10 behind first. So as soon as 2024, he could become the all-time sacker in Jags history and only build upon his very short career and young career already. So that's why I already put him as an honorable mention here, because he could grasp that legacy pretty quickly. And the final team on part 1 of this all-time top 5 players list We're going to go with the Kansas City Chiefs, man. At number 1, we've got Patrick Mahomes. Some people already think he's on pace to become the greatest quarterback of all time. They think he could be the greatest of all time. They think he's already top 2 or 3 or 4. Now, I may not think that yet, but I do believe that he is the best player in Chiefs history, and the numbers and the accomplishments speak for themselves. He's brought the most team success and the most individual accolades to Kansas City as a quarterback. A 2-time MVP, 2018, took the NFL by storm with the 50-touchdown campaign. 3 Super Bowl championships with 4 appearances already. Only 3 losses in 18 playoff games. That means he's 15-3 in the playoffs to start his career. He has never been to less than an AFC championship game in his entire NFL career. He had a 41-8 touchdown to interception ratio in the playoffs. He's a 2-time touchdown leader, a 5,000-yard passer. Patrick Mahomes is gifted, special, this generation's greatest QB. At number 2, Travis Kelce, arguably the greatest receiving tight end of all time, and the stats would certainly say that. Most yards in a single season for a tight end with a ton, okay? Had 7 1,000-yard seasons. I believe it was about 1,400 something, and I don't think he played the full season if I'm not mistaken, but 7 1,000-yard seasons is also a record for tight ends. He has the most playoff catches ever, surpassing Jerry Rice and Julian Edelman, and a 3-time champion, 4-time first-team All-Pro. Travis Kelce, I think the thing that stands out about him is his route running, his feel, and at his best, his yards after catch dynamic. You know, a lot of people get on him for not being the traditional type of tight end, but it doesn't even matter just because he's listed as a tight end. He's still a heck of a receiver. Even if you just listed him at wide receiver, he'd still be one of the best, considered one of the best in this era, one of the best of all time. He's one of the most productive football players of this decade, one of the top players of this decade, and certainly deserves to be number 2 on this list, in my opinion. And I do have him above Tony Gonzalez. So that means I have Travis Kelce above Tony Gonzalez in my all-time rankings. And I do. Tony Gonzalez led the NFL in catches in 2004, which is crazy because he's a tight end. You know, that's something I don't think Kelce's ever done, is lead receivers and tight ends in catches in a season. 6-time first-team All-Pro. That's more than Kelce. 14-time Pro Bowler. That's also more than Kelce. One incredible stat, he only had 2 fumbles and 1,327 touches, which is insane. 1,327 touches, 2 fumbles. Unbelievable. And then he's the receiving yards and receptions leader for tight ends in NFL history. Kelce still has some time to catch him, but man, Gonzalez has historic numbers. He played forever, right? He does not have the records that Kelce has or Gronk has. He doesn't have that top end production as much, but the longevity, the consistency of his career is outrageous. Derek Thomas is my number 4, who my dad would always bring up to me. Derek Thomas, one of the greatest pass rushers of all time. Of course, the single game sack leader of all time with 7 sacks in 1 football game. Had the leading sack man in 1990 with 20 on the season, a 2-time forced fumble leader, a defensive rookie of the year, and 7 different 10-plus sack seasons. He unfortunately passed away before he even retired, if I'm not mistaken, in the year 2000. An all-time pass rusher that could have still been going, man. So unfortunate ending to his career and life, but unbelievable player at his peak as one of the best outside linebacker pass rushers of all time. Bobby Bell is number 5, one of the great 60s defenders of the Chiefs in that amazing team that they had. They had about 4 or 5 different Hall of Fame defensive players on top of number 6, their quarterback Len Dawson, but Bobby Bell was my favorite out of all of them. 6 straight All-Pro seasons during that era, a Super Bowl champion. He was 6'4", 228, and at that size, he was still intercepting 4 passes 3 different seasons in his career as an outside linebacker. He could drop back into coverage. He could rush the quarterback. He had 40 sacks in his career. He had 26 interceptions in his career, and he had 8 touchdowns as a defender in his career. So Bobby Bell was a diverse, great athlete at linebacker that I feel like could have transferred to this era, even though he played in the 60s, which is incredible. Len Dawson, honestly, was one of the players that once I actually researched a little bit more, I didn't know too much other than that he won the Super Bowl. He was very swaggy, of course, the cigar, kind of like the old-fashioned Joe Burrow type vibe. Very good leader of that team. But Len Dawson was a lot better statistically than I thought he was. He led the NFL, or the AFL, I should say, 4 times in touchdowns, 6 times in passer rating, 7 times in completion percentage. He also was the MVP in 1962, a Super Bowl champion, and he still, believe it or not, more than Patrick Mahomes, leads the franchise in touchdowns and yards, which is insane. He still does. Mahomes is going to obviously get him probably this year, but man, that's crazy to think about. So shout out to Len Dawson, and shout out to you guys for lasting this entire video. If I'm being honest, I didn't expect it to go this long. We're only halfway through, so I'm going to make a part 2 for the top 5 greatest players in franchise history for all 32 teams, because these guys deserve that much time to talk about each team and each player. So I'll make a part 2 with the final 16 teams to go in depth on the final 16 teams. But thank you guys so much for watching. It's Mitch. We'll see you in the next video. Peace.